Smiles all round as Donald Trump gives Brexit the thumbs up. But can an America First president ever shake hands on a deal which works for Brits?
Obama said they'll go to the back of the line, meaning if it does happen, and then he had to retract. That was a bad statement.
And now we're at the front of the queue.
I think you're doing great.
Good evening. The sometime journalist, erstwhile Cabinet Minister Michael Gove, looked pleased as punch to land the first British interview with the President-elect, even if he'd missed the picture of a Playboy model pouting over his left shoulder. The encounter spoke volumes about what Britain can expect from the Brexit-admiring 45th president. Donald Trump promised a quick Anglo-American trade deal, said he trusts Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin equally, and described NATO as obsolete. But is a man questioning the existence of both the EU and NATO only ever going to be looking out for himself?
Also tonight, police units accused of delaying their arrival to the scene of a mass terror attack on a Tunisian beach in 2015. An inquest into the deaths of the 30 British people killed hears that some needlessly lost their lives. Northern Ireland's power-sharing government has collapsed as Sinn Féin refuses to nominate a new deputy minister. Fresh elections will now take place in March. And an inquest has heard how a series of hospital failures led to the death of a young mother. Frances Cappuccini had been begging for a caesarean section at Tunbridge Wells Hospital. Her distraught family say nothing can heal the pain caused by the NHS trust.
And I've been speaking to a rueful Michel Roux. The celebrity chef admits he made a terrible mistake paying some of his staff as little as £5.50 an hour last year while selling sautéed lobster for £60. But
I'm not the monster that a lot of people are actually making me out to be.
Well, it was an interview which benefited both inquisitor and inquisitee. Former Cabinet Minister and journalist Michael Gove got the scoop, the promise of a quick trade deal once Britain leaves the European Union. And Donald Trump, his detractors say, managed to avoid any tricky questions about his offensive views on Muslims and women. But what he did say on NATO, on Angela Merkel and on Russia was controversial enough. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
Michael Gove paid a visit to Trump Tower alongside the former editor of the German newspaper Bild. In an office packed with trophies, awards, portraits of himself, the President-elect told his visitors a US-UK trade deal would be done very quickly after Brexit. He was a big fan of Britain's decision to leave the EU.
I thought the UK was so smart in getting out. And you were there and you guys wrote it and put it on the front page.
Yes.
Trump said that Brexit is going to happen.
Yes.
Right? And it happened.
Yes.
And that was where it was going to lose easily. You know, everybody thought I was crazy. Obama said they'll go to the back of the line, meaning if it does happen, and then he had to retract. That was a bad statement.
And now we're at the front of the queue.
I think you're doing great.
He clearly feels that because he predicted Brexit, he's got some sort of ownership of the issue. So he clearly wants to make it work.
He says all that. That could be sales patter. You might be falling for the businessman who does all these deals, which he says are so brilliant.
It could be. And this is the critical thing. I suspect that, of
He
course...
could be out on a limb. He could just slap down a trade deal in front of us and say, sign it, there's no negotiation.
Well, I think that he has a warmth towards Britain. And certainly if you compare what he says about Britain and about the British approach to Brexit compared to what he says about Angela Merkel and Germany, then I think any fair-minded reader looking at the two would think that Theresa May is in a stronger position to forge a good relationship with him than the German Chancellor is at the moment.
The President-elect said he respected Chancellor Merkel, but that she'd made catastrophic mistakes on immigration policy. And then came this question.
Whom do you trust more if you talk to them, Angela Merkel or Vladimir Putin?
Well, I start off trusting both. But let's see how long that lasts. It may not last long at all.
Equating Chancellor Merkel today, meeting with New Zealand's Prime Minister, with the Russian President, sent a chill through Germany, one of America's strongest allies. Her foreign minister said the President-elect's comments on Germany and his description of NATO as obsolete caused astonishment and agitation in European governments.
Germany is a very strong strategic ally of America, and Russia's been trying to hack into the country and do disobliging things for a long time.
Yes.
Isn't that put a massive question mark over his judgment.
He expresses himself in a unique and sometimes very disconcerting fashion.
He sounds like a man who'd like the European Union project to unravel.
Yes. I think that he says in the interview that we asked explicitly, would he prefer to see a stronger Europe or stronger nation states? And he said that he was broadly indifferent to that. But he then went on to predict that he thought other countries would follow Britain out of the EU door.
I just passionately believe that for Britain it would be a fundamental error for us to, in effect, become a hapless pawn in a wider game in which Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump seek or collude, in effect, in the unravelling of the European Union.
Germany's foreign minister said President-elect Trump's interview quotations contradicted what some of his cabinet appointees were saying. Even those who spent an hour in Trump Tower just now are struggling.
In a short space of time, contradicts himself almost in every answer.
I don't think Donald Trump probably quotes Walt Whitman in the sense that when Walt Whitman said, "I contain multitudes," he was making a point that that big people can vary their opinions on issues. But I think even if you're a big person, you vary your opinion on issues, it's very rare that you would vary your opinion within a single answer. One of the things, though, about Trump is that he uses language in order to get certain messages across. And sometimes when he's occupying more than one position in the course of an answer, I think what he's probably seeking to do is to mask what his true intent is. He's a businessman.
Are you sure that's what he's doing? Isn't it?
I can't make a window out of Donald Trump.
He might just have a brain that doesn't operate very well, mightn't he?
Well, I think the thing about the way he operates is that he looks at things very much through the prism of deal-making, advantage, whether it's mutual advantage or advantage for America in jobs terms.
Back up in Trump Tower, the president-elect spoke of his Scottish mother and his German father. He said his German ancestry shaped his personality.
I like order. I like things done in an orderly manner.
Yeah.
And certainly the Germans, that's something that they're rather well known for. But I do, I like order and I like strength.
Is that what comes across to you? Does he seem to have an orderly mind?
I wouldn't use that word myself. If you look at his desk, you will see that in fact there's an array of paper across it, which suggests that he has an untidy desk and not necessarily a well-ordered mind.
Having met the man, spent some time with him, will you sleep slightly better after his inauguration, or still waking up in fits in the night?
I think there are reasons to be concerned, but at this stage I think that we're in the process of seeing candidate Trump, as I said earlier, change into President Trump. Of course, there are causes for concern about some of the things that he's said in the past, but at this stage, I just want to wait and see before passing a definitive judgment.
President-elect Trump said Theresa May will get her own opportunity to judge him in person, with a visit to Washington soon after his inauguration.
Well, in a moment, I'll talk to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris. But first, let's go to Westminster, and Gary is there again. Gary, how is this interview being read amongst MPs and ministers there?
A lot depends on where you're coming from in the first instance in your judgment on Donald Trump. You could hear there the agonies of Michael Gove, who is trying to be open-minded about this, trying to look for the best out of his interviewee. He is pro-NATO, Michael Gove, and so he's looking at it thinking, well, he did say it's obsolete as an organisation, but on the other hand, he said maybe you can reconfigure it and maybe you just need to put more money in it. Maybe that's all he really wants to do. On whether Brexit talks would actually bring a settlement that would be good, post-Brexit talks on trade with America would bring a settlement that would be good for Britain. You can hear Michael Gove hoping that's so, but not entirely knowing. The truth is there isn't the moderation in language that people would have expected this close to inauguration, and neither is there the clarity.
Now, finally, tomorrow, the Prime Minister is promising to flesh out just what she means by Brexit. What indications are you getting about whether we'll be any closer to knowing what's what?
I think you're going to get clarity on her plans saying that we will not remain members of the single market. If you're looking for absolute clarity on Britain coming out of the customs union in the EU, well, you can probably detect a direction of travel, but you're not going to get clarity on that. Neither clarity on the sort of immigration controls coming in, but it's to get immigration control that she needs to come out of the single market, and I think we'll probably get clarity on that.
Gary, thanks very much. More from you tomorrow. But let's go to Kylie in Washington now. And how are these latest pronouncements from Mr. Trump being read there?
Well, Kathy, this isn't the first time Americans have heard Mr. Trump attack NATO or indeed the EU, but there has been some pushback. Marco Rubio, the Republican senator, has said that NATO is as important today as it's been since the end of the Cold War. And indeed, we heard very similar testimony from the incoming Defense Secretary last week. But it is Donald Trump who is driving the bus, as his vice president says. It's his inauguration that they're preparing for here, polishing up the scaffolding. Sadly, it doesn't come in gold. Now, this is normally a honeymoon period, but new numbers from Gallup have Trump at a 40% approval rating, which is half of what President Obama was at before his inauguration. But before we get even to Friday, today is Martin Luther King Day in America, and the president-elect finds himself embroiled in another dispute, this time with civil rights icon John Lewis. A contemporary of Martin Luther King and one of the heroes of the civil rights struggle for racial justice and equality, Congressman John Lewis angered Donald Trump when he said he wouldn't attend Friday's inauguration.
I don't see this president-elect as a legitimate president.
Why is that?
I think the Russians participated in helping this man get elected, and they helped destroy the candidacy of Hillary Clinton.
Preparations for the inauguration are all around, but now 24 Democrats in Congress say they won't attend either, after the president-elect disparaged Congressman Lewis for questioning his legitimacy.
Donald Trump's comments to me are outrageous about saying the word legitimacy of his presidency when he spent so much time attacking Barack Obama about the legitimacy of his presidency. So to me, this is a painful reminder of the kind of person that's about to be president of the United States.
Mr. Trump's defenders say it's all just sour grapes from the Democrats.
What John Lewis is doing, he's pouting. He lost. It's like a spoiled child, and we've seen it with the others. They can't get over the fact they lost, and what do spoiled little kids do? You know, they run around and throw a tantrum.
The dispute has set Donald Trump at odds, though, with his own self-proclaimed aim of uniting the country, sparring with a civil rights hero when he says he wants to bring Americans together.
Trump's entire campaign has been a refutation, if you will, of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. You know, banning Muslims from entering the country, putting up the wall. It's all about preservation of culture, which is kind of a code word for, you know, separate but equal.
We shall overcome. On the streets of the Capitol, separate but equal wasn't in the songbook. These marchers may not have voted for Donald Trump, but they consider him their president, and they want respect in return.
I think he needs to tone down his rhetoric and reach out across the nation.
Respect all people.
To all people, and respect all people.
Donald Trump refuses to be distracted by history, domestic or foreign, which is why in his politics of now, long-held alliances like NATO and the European Union are diminished. But he'll meet resistance from both sides of politics if he moves to disentangle America from Europe and move closer to Russia.
That is colossally dangerous, given where we stand in the world right now, especially with Russian aggressions in the Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and what Russia's doing in the Baltic states.
4 days to go, and the president-elect is shaking things up, just as he promised he would.
Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the MP and joint leader of the Green Party, Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas first. The US declared independence 240 years ago. UK declaring independence from the EU now is bound to bring us sort of emotionally closer, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly clear that this is a government that is desperate to get President Trump's, or soon-to-be President Trump's, approval. And really watching that interview with Michael Gove was pretty excruciating, just to see how obsequious he was being to Trump. You know, when Trump says that Obama was wrong to say that we're going to be back at the end of the queue for trade deals, then Gove jumps in and says, oh, we're going to be at the beginning then. And he says, oh, no, you're doing great. But he doesn't answer it. He brushes us away. So I think that there's clear that the government wants us to be breathing new life into this special relationship. But my fear is that in their haste to do so, then they're going to be rushing into new trade deals and so forth, which will not have our social and environmental protections at their heart.
I'll come back to that in a minute. But Kwasi Kwarteng, did you find it excruciating to watch? I mean, you know, thumbs up, posing with the Playboy just over his left shoulder.
I found it mildly entertaining. I think that it was a good interview in the sense that he clearly had established a rapport with Trump. It's the first interview that Michael Gove or any British journalist had with Donald Trump. And I don't think that that was the forum to necessarily be very aggressive. I think it's a good thing if America want to do deals with us post-Brexit. I think that's something to be welcomed. And I don't think, I don't have much fear about it.
Well, it's just pragmatism, isn't it? You know, as the EU threatens to unravel, we need to do that deal with the US, don't we?
Certainly we will need some trade agreements if we are indeed coming out of the EU. But the worry there, I think, is this sense that it's got to be done really quickly. Somehow that's got to be some kind of badge of the success of Brexit will be that if we manage to get this US trade deal done in a matter of months. Now, that is a ridiculous proposal. I mean, the average time to do a trade deal with the US is about 4 years. With Canada, it was 7 years. So the worry is that this government is so desperate to get Trump's approval that they will accept a trade deal that actually is not in our best interest.
Look, we have to establish the first thing. As far as I understand, I may be wrong, we can't actually do a deal until we've left the EU. And we can't leave the EU, forgive me, until we've actually triggered Article 50, and that'll take 2 years. So any deal will be signed, sealed and delivered at least 2 years from now.
Yes, but the US could get a deal all ready to go, which, as Caroline Lucas here says, could dilute consumer and employee and environmental protections to the detriment of the UK.
I don't think that's where we're heading. I mean, if you look at Trump's rhetoric, he's been accused by people in his own country of being a protectionist, of essentially wanting something like a trade war with China and Mexico. So it's very much in his interest to show, I'm not a protectionist, I want to do a deal with the United Kingdom.
So it's not rhetoric. I mean, if you look at the people he's surrounded himself with his appointments to his administration, at least 9 of them are climate skeptics, deniers. He himself has said that he thinks climate change is a Chinese hoax. So the idea that this is going to be a president that is going to care about environmental concerns, social concerns, consumer concerns, I think is cloud cuckoo land. And when we're not there with the protections that we've had under the EU, then I really do worry for the protections in this country.
No, but the government has made it very clear that we're totally committed to the climate change agenda.
Well, then you won't get a trade agreement in a matter of months.
We're totally committed to preserving environmental protections.
But that's the point, isn't it? You're not going to get a deal with the US unless you move their way. It's going to be in their interest. I mean, what he's saying on NATO proves that he's out for number one. He's out for America first.
He's also a pragmatist. And also, we've got to accept that, as of today, the United States is our biggest trading partner. We trade more with the United States, I think 20% of our trade, than any other single country. So there's clearly a lot of mutual benefit in coming to a good trade deal.
And at the very least, it will strengthen the prospect of this deal between the UK and the US, will strengthen Theresa May's negotiating hand, won't it, as she tries to negotiate with the rest of the EU?
Well, that may be the case, but let's also not forget what Philip Hammond was saying about the real risk that we're going to be there as this some kind of tax haven, corporate tax haven floating off the end of Europe. That isn't a vision that I think we should be aspiring to. We're much better than that, and we should be working for something better than that.
Or perhaps you do aspire to it.
Well, I have a very different view in terms of business. I mean, perhaps people in Caroline's party think of business as an enemy. In my constituency,
no, I don't think I said
business creates employment. The taxes that people pay as individuals when they work in a business help the general
but we're not talking about that. We're talking about corporate tax
I've always argued for lower taxes on corporations.
So you'd like us to be a floating tax haven?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as that. But if you look at Ireland, that's sort of floating tax haven, but it attracts business through the low corporation tax rate. That's an entirely legitimate thing to aspire to.
I think there's a real debate to be had here about what this is going to mean for the so-called social model that we've had in the UK until now. Because up until recently, we've had around 45% of GDP going into public services. Under George Osborne, even at the last election, we had a vision that he was setting out that we would aspire to be about 36% of funding into public services. What that really means in real terms is that the NHS, which is already on its knees and in crisis, is going to be in even more crisis. Now, you might want that for your constituents,
no, I don't.
But I certainly don't. And that means that that kind of very low tax base is not going to be a sustainable or a good way forward.
Kwasi Kwarteng, Caroline Lucas, thank you very much for joining us. Fatima.
Now, fresh elections will be held in Northern Ireland after the power-sharing agreement collapsed. Sinn Féin refused to nominate a new Deputy First Minister after Martin McGuinness stood down last week. 2 hours ago, the Northern Ireland Secretary, James Brokenshire, announced the polls will be held on March 2nd. Our political correspondent, Michael Crick, joins us live from Westminster now. Michael.
Yes, well, Theresa May made a last-minute intervention this morning, phoning Arlene Foster, the leader of the DUP, and Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin to try and avert the collapse of the power-sharing executive. That intervention failed. It all stems from, in part, from a row over a green energy scheme and Arlene Foster's role in that. Sinn Féin said that she should step down as First Minister for a few weeks while the scheme was investigated. She refused. Hence, Martin McGuinness stepping down as Deputy First Minister last week. And under the rather complicated rules of the power-sharing agreement, after 7 days, Arlene Foster has to step down as well, and there'll now be elections on May the 2nd. The outcome of those elections probably won't be that different from last time. Only last May were the last elections, with the DUP and Sinn Féin likely to emerge as the biggest parties. They'll then have 3 weeks until the 23rd of March to try and resolve their differences, possibly under new leaders. If they fail to do so, then it's possible that the Northern Ireland Secretary James Brokenshire will call yet another round of elections. Slightly more likely is that he'll push emergency legislation through Westminster to bring back a period of direct rule from Whitehall while the parties resolve their differences. A big question tonight, what about the future of Martin McGuinness? He's rather ill at the moment. There's a question as to whether he'll stand in these elections. If he doesn't, that will be the end of perhaps one of the most controversial careers of modern politics.
Michael, thanks very much. Now, an inquest into the death of Frances Cappuccini has concluded that failures, inadequate diagnosis and treatment at Tunbridge Wells Hospital caused her death. The 30-year-old primary school teacher died of a heart attack just 8 hours after giving birth to her second son in 2012. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald reports.
Photos filled with hopes and dreams of a future. But in October 2012, Frances Cappuccini died 8 hours after giving birth to her second son. Now an inquest into Mrs Cappuccini's death at Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust has concluded that it was avoidable. A verdict that brought tears and despair, but also some relief to her family.
Frances Cappuccini, Frankie, was a wonderful wife, mother, daughter and sister. She was bubbly, intelligent, beautiful, loving and much loved. Failures of Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust and those employed by the Trust cost Frankie her life. Nothing can heal that pain. At least today, after over 4 years, the truth is acknowledged.
Her husband, Tom Cappuccini, arriving for the verdict this morning, has had to relive every moment of those hours in the hospital, including his wife's emergency caesarean section.
But it's what happened to Mrs Cappuccini after that caesarean section here at Tunbridge Wells. The coroner said today that there were failures, that there was inadequate diagnosis and treatment. And it left many in that courtroom today feeling that opportunities had been missed to save her life.
Mrs Cappuccini was rushed back to theatre after she began to bleed heavily. It was found a piece of placenta had been left in following the C-section. The coroner, Roger Hatch, said today,
"The result of this failure led directly to the subsequent series of events which tragically ended in the death of Frances."
Last year, the Trust was cleared of corporate manslaughter, the first trial of its kind against an NHS hospital. Dr Nadim Aziz, the anaesthetist looking after Mrs Cappuccini, was also cleared of gross negligence manslaughter. But today the coroner said Dr Aziz, who is now in Pakistan, should have been supervised after a similar incident. It was found Mrs Cappuccini's breathing tube was taken out too soon and not put back in quickly enough. And the Trust's own protocols were not followed by staff, including extremely poor record keeping. But it was also revealed today that Mrs Cappuccini was in all probability suffering from sepsis and or acute kidney injury when she first arrived at the hospital, but that it wasn't diagnosed or treated. This has now been added to her death certificate. The Trust has apologised to the family. They said, as a direct result of Frances's tragic death, the Trust has made a number of changes to its processes that have further improved patient safety and experience. More than 4 years later, Mrs Cappuccini's family now knows what happened. It brings, as they said today, some solace, but does not heal the pain.
Victoria MacDonald reporting there. Now, it was the deadliest terror attack on Britain since the London bombings of 7/7. Today, the inquest into the deaths of 30 British tourists killed in Tunisia began with a minute's silence in their memory. The gunman opened fire on the holidaymakers in a resort near Sousse in the summer of 2015. But today's inquest has heard the attack, claimed by the Islamic State group, could have been stopped sooner, as Jane Deeth reports.
Their families went for some summer sun in Tunisia and never came home. In court, the names of those murdered on their holidays were read out, followed by a minute's silence. They were killed by radicalised Tunisian student Saifeddine Rezghi. The High Court was shown the moment he arrived at the Imperial Mahaba Hotel, on CCTV being dropped off in a white van and taking something out of the boot. This was a parasol hiding a Kalashnikov. He also had grenades. A shadow in black, he goes onto the beach and starts shooting. The court watched pictures of people running. The Metropolitan Police has mapped where his victims died, by the sea, by the pool, and inside the hotel. The court watched this eyewitness footage. The seemingly never-ending gunshots and panic. Then the dreadful silence on the beach. It was nearly 40 minutes before Saifeddine Rezghi was shot dead by police. Why? The inquest heard a Tunisian investigation found local security officers could have put an end to the massacre, but they deliberately and unjustifiably slowed down, delaying their arrival at the hotel. Why they wasted time is a question that hasn't been answered yet. The coroner's also examining the travel advice offered by the Foreign Office and Thomson Holidays. 3 months before, Islamic State militants had killed tourists at the Bardo National Museum in Tunis. Jane Marriott was responsible for the Foreign Office travel advice, which said the terror threat was high.
She said that the day after the Bardo Museum attack, the travel advice was strengthened to say that further attacks were possible, and that the UK government told Tunisia it wanted to see improvements in security. But the Foreign Office stopped short of advising against travel to the country.
The inquests will also look at the actions of Thomson. Its parent company TUI will give evidence and face questions about security at the hotel.
Well, Islamic State militants have launched their fiercest attack in a year on the Syrian city of Deir ez-Zor, in a battle which has killed dozens. But in Iraq, the terrorist group continue to lose key positions against coalition forces in the city of Mosul. Government troops say they are in control of almost all the eastern part of the city and are pushing IS militants out of the last neighbourhoods. In recent days, special forces retook the university and are now pushing on towards the Tigris River. And so, as they continue to lose ground in Iraq, does this strengthen or diminish the threat the Islamic State group represents to global security? Well, with me to discuss this are Loretta Napoleoni, an expert on terrorist financing. She advises several governments and international organisations on counter-terrorism, and the journalist Graham Wood, who has written extensively about the motivations behind IS. Welcome to you both. Graham, can I turn to you first? Do you think that we have fundamentally misunderstood what the Islamic State group is about?
I think there has been a very steep learning curve. For a long time, the Islamic State was seen as a local phenomenon, and I think we now know that it's quite a bit beyond that. It is a global phenomenon. It has inspired people from many corners of the earth, and it intends to expand far beyond Syria and Iraq, including southern Philippines, other parts of Africa. Its footprint is global.
And one of the things that you have emphasised is this idea that the Islamic State is not Islamic is false.
Yes, I think that it is very easy to see the ways in which they draw on the Islamic tradition. They're not the only inheritors of that tradition, but they do take it seriously, and they have a view of themselves that is rooted in Islamic theology and law.
OK, we'll come back to that point. Loretta, can I just come to you? You believe that the IS group is much less about ideology, but actually about making cash.
Well, I mean, cash is very important. Of course, you know, without the cash, they could not have built the caliphate. They also could not vote. for 2.5 years, the way they did against the largest coalition on earth. But at the same time, I think the most important element is the nationalist element, meaning we create a state, we create a caliphate, we exploit the resources of the caliphate, not directly, not in a totalitarian way, but by handing over these resources to the tribal leaders. And then the tribal leaders will pay taxes, which is more or less the same system than we have in the West.
But,
so it's
but you,
very
think
modern.
you think we've been guilty of ignoring the role that Western governments have played in the creation of this group?
I don't think so much Western governments as the allies of Western governments. So we're talking about the Gulf state primarily. I think we simply did not pay any attention to what was happening in the Middle East. We delegated the responsibility of what was happening in Syria to our allies. And that was a mistake because Syria is our backyard. This is the backyard of Europe. So it is our responsibility.
So, Graham, this idea that ideology is very important and that the group is somehow rooted in Islamic theology, aren't you just giving ISIS what they want? I mean, they want this sort of legitimacy, don't they?
They certainly want to portray themselves in this way, but it's still a matter of fact. My book is the product of talking for 2 years to people who follow the Islamic State, who say that they believe that it is the fulfillment of prophecy. And each of these people will say very clearly that the establishment of a caliphate is a religious obligation. That's the way that they see it. Now, of course, there are elements to this that are local phenomena. There's politics, there's money involved. It is, it's a state. It is a government that needs to administer territory. And so you will see things that are not theological about it. But in the end, everybody who has gone there has said that they believe it is a religious fulfillment in addition to whatever else it is.
So what happens once they lose territory in Iraq, for instance? How does the group then evolve?
Well, we've already seen it try to take territory elsewhere. It has tried to remind people that there is other territory where it already has people who are following it, who have claimed to act on its behalf. And I mentioned the southern Philippines before. Boko Haram would be another example, and there are many more besides. I think what we're going to see, what they've already promised, is that as they lose territory in Mosul and Raqqa, and I hope that happens quickly, there will be a retreat into the desert in their core territory and more emphasis on expanding overseas.
Loretta, how about you? How do you think the group's going to evolve?
Well, I think the group has already evolved. I think it has gone back to the terrorist kind of techniques that are typical of terrorism. So we'll see.
Does that mean more terror attacks in Europe?
Yes, absolutely. Not only in Europe, wherever they can get an attack, it doesn't matter because the impact. So how many people know that actually they're losing Mosul, but everybody knows what's happening in Berlin. So that's the tactic. It doesn't matter that you are actually controlling a large territory. As long as you are in the news, as long as you are perceived as very strong, that's what they want.
Graham Wood, how do you see the approach to tackling ISIS changing under President Trump?
Well, President Trump has said that the cornerstone of his foreign policy is attacking radical Islam, that jihadism is the absolute boogeyman that all of his foreign policy will be directed at. What that actually means is unclear. He seems to have very little understanding of the differences between Islamic groups, Islamist groups. That jihadism is a unified force in his view, which happens not to be true. The differences between ISIS and Al-Qaeda are
a new US
significant.
administration could make the problem worse then?
Absolutely, yes. And I think that that's very likely. If you frame your entire foreign policy on the basis of a misunderstanding, then you're likely to have very poor results.
Okay. Graham Wood, Loretta Napoleoni, thank you so much for coming in.
Now, Michel Roux Jr. had always been a champion of better working conditions for his chefs, but a lot of that goodwill evaporated when it emerged that some staff at his Michelin-starred London restaurant Le Gavroche were being paid less than the minimum wage last year. In his first TV interview since the story broke, I asked him about that, but also about the other big challenge confronting the restaurant world, Brexit. Does he agree with President-elect Trump's statement that Brexit would be great for Britain?
Well, I voted to remain, but I'm certainly not a Remoaner. I think that Britain is strong, and I believe in Britain. And I think it's time that the Remainers actually looked forward, worked together to make this place great.
But, I mean, clearly there will be an impact of Brexit on the restaurant sector. I mean, what proportion, for example, of your staff are from the EU?
Oh, gosh, I think it's just over half of my staff must be from the EU.
So they must be feeling slightly anxious about what the future holds.
Well, absolutely. The day after the result, I had several of them come up to me and some in tears saying, what's going to happen? You know, and I said, well, calm down. It's minimum 2 years before there's anything that's going to happen. But it would be great to get some clarity about their status. I mean, I'm the son of immigrants myself. My parents came to this country in 1958. I was born here. I have dual nationality. So I feel European, but I feel very British as well.
I mean, there have been suggestions that thousands of restaurants could close because of Brexit. Do you think that's wide of the mark, or is that a fairly accurate prediction, do you think?
I think it's a fairly accurate prediction. I think closures in 2017 will be in the thousands, most definitely.
Clearly, Brexit is only one of the challenges facing your sector at the moment. The government's raised the minimum wage. You had the embarrassment of having to reimburse a lot of your staff who you were paying less than the minimum wage. How many staff have you had to reimburse?
The one thing about me is that I don't hide away from, from my mistakes, and I'm the first one to put my hand up if I do make a mistake. The important thing is learning from that and to move forward. I can't go back in time and undo my mistake. There were a few staff that worked too many hours, and that meant that their wage was under the minimum, which I've made good, paid back, still in the process of paying back because there were some which needed looking into in depth to pay them back in full.
But how could you not have been aware of the fact that they were working such long hours? I mean, everybody knows that people in restaurants work crazy hours.
Absolutely. And the issue happened during the year where we had exceptional circumstances here, sickness, holidays, and it escaped me. I put my hands up, it was my error.
How many hours were these staff that were underpaid working? What was the maximum that they were working a week or a day?
60 plus, just over 60 plus. And that's, I think, the maximum really that we should be working. And even then, when you're working 60 hours, there are days where you find it tough. But it is in our industry. Our industry is tough.
A lot of people find it really offensive that a main course on your menu is £60. Admittedly, it's lobster, but it's £60. And you've got staff who had been working for £5.50 an hour. I mean, do you find that offensive?
Of course, and I have said so. I have said so. I have apologised, put my hand up, and it will not happen again. You know, I think I've been painted as a monster, and I can understand the anger of the public. I can fully understand that, because it's bad. But I'm not the monster that a lot of people are actually making me out to be. This is a great place to work. It's a great place to learn, and it's a great place to move up the ranks, as it were.
You have held up your hands, said you made a mistake, but you are still defiant on the service charge, aren't you? That you're not going to be passing on that service charge to your staff.
Now, to be very clear on the service charge and the tips, all of the service charge here goes to wages. Every single penny, and nothing is deducted. All of the tips, every single penny, go to staff and are distributed by staff. Some of the headlines were, quite frankly, disgraceful. I mean,
well, you said you saw service charges as revenue, didn't you? And that kind of annoyed people, because a lot of people in a restaurant, they think the service charge is going straight to the waiters and waitresses who have stood at their table.
Absolutely, that is the ambiguity at the moment of the service charge. I mean, some of the headlines, Chef Michel Roux pockets the tips. I mean, really?
So if the government goes ahead and bans employers taking a cut, how would you react to that?
For me, there has to be a clear look at this from within the catering industry. And if the catering industry doesn't get this right or do something about this, then I think the government has to get involved to make it clear, crystal clear to their customers where the money is going to. And that's why I decided a couple of years ago to stop the service charge at one of my restaurants in London, Roux at Parliament Square, to make it crystal clear. And that's why moving forward here, I will be going also service included, which means that the price that you see advertised and the prices on the menu is the full price that reflects wages, staff, breakages, the lot. That is what you pay. There isn't a nasty surprise at the end of the bill which says service extra.
Michel Roux talking to me at Le Gavroche earlier. No lobster was served. Fatima.
Now, it was one of Donald Trump's key campaign promises, a wall along the US southern border with Mexico, paid for by the Mexicans themselves. The policy has led to a surge in people trying to make it to the US before the election. Our Latin America correspondent, Guillermo Galdos, has been documenting one such family and their race against the wall.
4 months ago, we followed two sisters who left their home in El Salvador, hoping to reach the US before Election Day.
Nos topamos con mucha gente mala y buena.
Fleeing violence in their hometown.
Es normal que vayan a matar a la gente, la dejen tirada. Los maderos los acosaban y decían que ellos podían matar.
12-year-old Fatima and her older sister Brenda risked everything to make the illegal journey.
Y uno ya se venía muriendo. Y la tía así va, que ya se había muerto porque ya ni abría los ojos.
The plan was to join their mom and two brothers in California.
No crea, para mí no es fácil esto. Pensar que mis hijos me les puede pasar algo en el camino.
The mom paid smugglers to bring them to her through lands controlled by drug lords, illegally crossing 3 borders, finally arriving just weeks before polling day. Their new home is a small city in California, a liberal state, but this is a Trump-loving town.
No sé, pero es que si gana ese señor, pues los pueden regresar para nuestros países. Y hemos sufrido para llegar acá y para que los manden.
Clarice and her sons, Edgar and Santos, also smuggled themselves here to escape El Salvador's violence. She had not seen her daughters in 4 years. As results come in,
Son cosas del Salvador.
messages from friends back home also help keep spirits up.
Pasan todo un noviembre publicando que extrañan las Navidades en El Salvador. No se preocupen, ya los voy a empezar a mandar para allá. Ya estuvo, ese chiste.
But they soon stop laughing.
En Pensilvania, 72.9 y 24.4.
Then reality bites. Clarice has risked everything to get her and her children somewhere safe and avoid the life she's had.
Eso los aterroriza, no tenemos miedo, tenemos terror. Tenemos terror porque nosotros somos unas personas indocumentadas en este país y sabemos que de un rato a otro nos toca regresar a nuestro país. Que Donald Trump es presidente y a nosotros se los terminó la vida.
It's the morning after the night before. But 12-year-old Fatima still has class at her new school in California.
Escucha a los maestros y aprender inglés con todo para que seas presidenta para unos 20 años en adelante. ¿Qué te parece la idea? ¿Eh? ¿Sí, no? Bye, cuídate, pórtate bien. Bye.
Fatima should be allowed to remain in the country until she turns 18. An American schoolyard feels a world away from the dangers outside her old playground in El Salvador.
Sí, me siento feliz en mi escuela porque hago amigos, amistades y bueno, voy todos los días a la escuela, me divierto en mi escuela.
But the US will soon march to a different beat.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
First job, to learn English.
On your mark, get set, and go. On November. To Egypt.
To Egypt.
Carter.
And with a little help, she's getting there.
The tomb of King. And Clayton, what needed to be done with English?
Around a quarter of the students at this school are immigrants, many from Latin America.
It affects us as a nation when our kids have to live in fear of being taken back. They don't speak about those fears outwardly because they're trying to fit in and assimilate to American culture.
Over the American staple of milk with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, they seek to watch their next president's victory speech.
I say it is time for us to come together as one united people. It's time.
And with Fatima at her new school, Edgar and Brenda get ready for work, picking fruit.
Este país es lo que es también por los indocumentados, por esas personas que muchos discriminan, que muchos miran así como abajo, son las personas que levantan este país. ¿Y qué va a ser de Estados Unidos sin las personas que están ahorita en los files trabajando? ¿Quién va a ir ahí a trabajar por nosotros?
Nearly half the country's food is grown here in California, harvested by Hispanics from fields owned by Americans.
Vamos a trabajar, por lo menos yo.
President-elect Donald Trump has called Latinos drug dealers, rapists, and criminals.
Yo tengo dos trabajos. Trabajo en el campo en la mañana, cuerto uvas. Trabajo en un restaurante en la tarde. Yo no tengo tiempo para robarle a nadie.
There are some 11 million undocumented migrants pursuing the American dream. But with Trump, that dream could soon become a nightmare.
Pues donde quiera que vaya, voy a temer que va a estar migración, que van a haber retenes y que nos agarran y nos mandan a El Salvador. Nosotros nos hemos venido de nuestro país huyendo, tenemos miedo, amenazados, y regresar a nuestro país uno sabe de que ya no va a nada bueno.
The family are in Los Angeles to meet an immigration lawyer.
Cuando usted llegaba aquí, entraste sin papeles, ¿verdad? Entonces, el gobierno se pone a usted en procedimientos de deportación.
Es mi nueva vida, lo pasado quedó en el pasado, pero cuando salió Donald Trump lo miro muy mal porque yo sé ellos tenían esperanza y ya como estamos todos, estamos felices, ¿verdad? Y que hoy que ha ganado este señor, como los miro tristes.
From El Salvador to California, this family's journey may not be over yet.
Guillermo Galdos reporting there. After the break, the American novelist Paul Auster on putting down his pen in response to the election of Donald Trump.
Welcome back. The acclaimed American novelist Paul Auster hasn't hesitated in his condemnation of Donald Trump, and it's led him to want to pause writing fiction. Instead, he says he'll be appointed the president of PEN, a human rights group established to defend writers and freedom of expression. Jon Snow went to meet him in New York.
Paul Auster uses his writing to explore identity and personal meaning. Who better then to explore the phenomenon that is Donald Trump? I visited him in his beautiful home in Brooklyn, high above the East River that flanks New York City. He writes in longhand and then transfers it paragraph by paragraph onto his old typewriter. In exploring Donald Trump, I started by suggesting to Paul Auster that he was living in a liberal bubble, far removed from the kinds of people who'd actually elected Trump.
I admit that I live in a bubble. I admit that I don't know a single person who voted for him. But at the same time, Donald Trump is not a complete stranger to me. He lives in New York. He grew up in New York. We've seen Donald Trump for decades. And I have to say that among the people in my bubble, no one has ever liked him. He's mostly ridiculed or despised as the figure he is. No, I don't believe that he's going to make the world a better place. I think what he's proposing to do, and we can see this in his choice of cabinet, is pretty much to dismantle American society. I've always thought about American institutions as rather solid. And they work because of laws, but also because of trust and precedent and convention. And so you think of them as solid granite buildings. And now, with this new order coming in, I understand that these buildings are built out of soap. And once Trump and his group start shooting their hoses at these buildings, they could just melt into suds running through the streets. That's what I fear most.
You're depicting a sort of Armageddon.
Well, I think I'm not talking about armed struggle. I'm just talking about the dismantling of the intricate interrelations we have that keep this country afloat. And to take away health care, for example, is going to kill people. So I'm very scared, but at the same time, angry. Very, very angry. And I think there are millions who share my views. I'm not alone in this. And I think it's our job now, as conscientious citizens of America, people who actually love this country, to resist and to push back.
You have known about Trump for many, many years. When did you finally spot him coming?
That's a good question. I think I never thought of him as a political figure at all. He was just this, I thought, a rich person who liked to build gaudy buildings and put his name on them and marry blonde women from Central Europe. And I didn't give him much thought beyond that. It was after Obama was elected and he started this birther business. And I realized how...
The question of whether he was really an American.
How vicious this attack was, and how relentless, and how he had the capability of getting people to believe him.
But I must press you, because, look, we've lived with hatred of Russia for decades and decades, well, since the revolution, probably before. How about somebody making a new break and trying to get alongside Putin?
There's been this strange feeling I've had, is that Putin has his foot on Trump's neck, and that Trump doesn't want to cross him. And so he makes a great show of amiability and rapprochement.
Will you use your writing to try to address these things and somehow undermine them?
Well, for years I've been involved in a very important organization to me, PEN. PEN is the only organization, human rights organization, supporting writers around the world.
Freedom of expression.
Yes, and this is a very important issue to me. They've asked me several times to become president, and I've said no, because I wanted to concentrate on my work. Well, now I'm going to do it. The position will open up in a year, not right away. There's a president in place now. But if they still want me in a year, that's what I'll do. And I'll use that as a platform for speaking out on these issues that concern me so much. And my writing will just continue, and we'll see what happens with that.
Paul Auster talking to Jon Snow earlier. Tonight's main news, President-elect Donald Trump has promised a quick Anglo-American trade deal post-Brexit in an interview with The Times. The remarks were welcomed by the Prime Minister, but tonight French President François Hollande responded to Trump's criticism of the EU by saying it didn't need to be told what to do by outsiders.
We're back tomorrow at 7. It'll be great. Join us.
That's it from us for tonight, though. Very good evening to you.
Good evening.